In 1836, the engineers of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal approved a job they were sure would take 2 years. Bore a single tunnel through one mountain in western Maryland and skip 6 miles of twisting river. 14 years later, that tunnel was still swallowing money. It cost more than $600,000 against an estimate of $33,500, and by the day it finally opened, it had very nearly bankrupted the entire canal. The engineer who had talked the board into digging it was named Charles Fisk. I want to be fair to Fisk, because on paper he was right. The Potomac River near the little town of Paw Paw does something strange. It coils back on itself in a run of great horseshoe bends, a stretch the boatmen knew as the Paw Paw Bends, and following the water there would have forced the canal builders to carve 6 extra miles of ditch along cliffs and floodplain, crossing and recrossing the same reluctant river. Fisk looked at that map and made the argument any sharp engineer would make. Do not chase the river around the mountain. Go through it. A tunnel of barely more than half a mile would erase 6 miles of canal. On the ledger, in the year 1836, that was the intelligent, thrifty, forward-looking choice. It was also the choice that nearly ended the whole enterprise. The mountain was called Sorrel Ridge, and the contract to pierce it went to a man named Lee Montgomery. Montgomery was not a career canal engineer. He was a Methodist minister who had crossed over into contracting, and he took the tunnel on believing, like everyone else on the board, that it was a 2-year piece of work. He would end up spending the rest of his working life on it. He would pour in his own money, his own name, and years he could never buy back, and the job would hand him bankruptcy in return. This is the part of the story the pretty towpath signs tend to skip. The Paw Paw Tunnel is a marvel to stand inside today. Getting it built was closer to a slow financial disaster that happened to end in brick. Here is the figure that should stop you cold. 3,118 feet. That is the length of the finished bore, about 6/10 of a mile, and it took 14 years and more than $500,000 of overrun to open that 6/10 of a mile. Now set that against what was happening one valley to the east. While the canal company poured cash into this ridge, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was laying iron toward the very same destination, the coal town of Cumberland. The railroad reached Cumberland in 1842. The canal would not arrive until 1850. In other words, the tunnel that was meant to save the canal helped guarantee the canal lost the race to its own finish line by a full 8 years. The doubt, the delay, and the debt are the real story here, and they all trace back to one mountain that refused to cooperate. So let me walk through what this actually required, because the how is where the wonder lives. Start with the rock, because the rock is where the trouble started. When Fisk and Montgomery planned the bore, they assumed they were driving through solid stone, the honest kind you can blast, square off, and trust to carry its own weight overhead. What they actually hit was Brallier shale. Shale is not solid in the reassuring way granite is solid. It forms in thin, brittle, stacked layers, laid down as ancient mud and pressed into sheets, and when you cut into it and strip away the support around it, it does not stay put. It shears along those layers. It slabs off. It comes down in plates without much warning. The men boring the tunnel were working inside a mountain that kept trying to fall into the hole they were opening. That one geological fact, invisible on every survey map drawn in 1836, is most of the reason a 2-year job swelled into a 14-year ordeal. You cannot rush a ceiling that wants to collapse. You have to line it as fast as you open it, and lining takes brick, and brick takes time and money the canal did not have. To even reach the mouth of the tunnel, the crews first had to open what the engineers called the deep cut, a steep-walled canyon sliced into the approach at the southern end. They were digging a long trench through that same treacherous shale before the tunnel proper even began, and the walls of the cut kept slumping back in almost as fast as the men could clear them. Every load hauled out invited another slide from above, and the shale did more than threaten the men. It threatened the schedule and the budget every single day, because a stretch that collapsed had to be dug a second time and lined again in brick at full cost, as if the first attempt had never happened. The mountain could quietly undo weeks of work in an afternoon. Now the method, and this is where you should picture it, because there is nothing modern anywhere in it. There was no electricity out here, no compressed air drills, and no dynamite, because dynamite had not even been invented yet. The men bored the tunnel with black powder and their own arms. Here is the actual motion of the work. One man held an iron rod called a drill steel against the rock face. A second man swung a heavy hammer and struck the end of that steel, and after each blow the first man rotated the steel a fraction of a turn, so the cutting edge bit a fresh angle. Blow after blow, turn after turn, they pounded a narrow hole into solid shale by hand, an inch at a time, sometimes for hours just to sink a single charge hole. Then they packed that hole with black powder, set a fuse, backed away into the dark, and let the blast tear loose whatever it would. When the smoke cleared, the pick and shovel work began, the crews clearing the shattered shale by hand, basket by basket and cart by cart, hauling it back out of the mountain so the drilling could start again on the fresh face. The pace alone shows you how brutal this was. On a good week, working like that, the tunnel advanced about 12 feet. 12 feet in a week. You can walk the length of a good week's work in about 2 seconds. And that was a good week, in ground that was cooperating. There were weeks the mountain gave back less than it took. Digging inward from both ends would have been slow enough on its own, so the engineers did something cleverer and far more difficult. They sank 2 vertical shafts down from the top of Sorrel Ridge, straight into the surveyed line of the tunnel far below, and then began digging outward from the bottom of each shaft in both directions. That turned 2 working faces into 6, 3 teams able to attack the rock from 3 points along the line at once. It also created a punishing new chore. Every basket of broken shale knocked loose deep inside the mountain now had to be hoisted straight up those shafts to daylight, load after load, by hand and by horse-powered lift. Over the life of the project, the crews dragged more than 200,000 cubic yards of rock and rubble out of this one ridge. 200,000 cubic yards, moved without a single engine, 1 hammer blow and 1 basket at a time. And consider the precision the shafts demanded. To dig toward each other from 6 separate points in total darkness and have the passages actually meet, the surveyors had to fix the line of the tunnel across the top of a mountain and drop it hundreds of feet down 2 shafts without modern instruments, and be right. A small error in that math, multiplied across 3,000 feet of blind digging, and the headings miss each other inside the rock entirely. They did not miss. Hold that thought, because the moment those headings met is coming, and it is the best moment in this whole story. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. Now the brick, because a tunnel through crumbling shale cannot be left as bare rock. Bare Brallier shale is precisely the thing that keeps sliding down onto the towpath, so the entire bore, both walls and the full arch overhead, had to be lined. And the scale of that lining is almost hard to believe. The Paw Paw Tunnel is faced with more than 6 million bricks. Sit with that number for a second. 6 million, and not one of them carted in from a distant brickyard, because there was no rail line and no good road to carry that many bricks into this remote valley in the 1840s. So the bricks were made on the spot, out of local clay, fired in kilns built right beside the canal cut. Archaeologists working the ground around the tunnel today still find the brick clamps and the ash beds where those millions of bricks were baked. The crews were running an entire brick factory in the wilderness just to feed the mountain its new lining. And the lining had to keep pace with the digging, because every foot of fresh bore left uncovered was a foot of shale looking for an excuse to come down. Think about the discipline hidden in that arch. Near the southern portal, the brick lining runs several courses thick, wrapped around the passage like the growth rings of a tree, with dressed stone at the portal face and brick running back into the dark. A masonry arch holds itself up through nothing but the exact fit of its pieces pressing against one another. There is no steel skeleton inside it. Lay the courses true, and the arch will stand for centuries. Lay them careless, and the shale finds the weakness and comes down. The men setting all that brick were doing precision masonry by lamplight, deep inside a mountain that had already shown, again and again, that it wanted to collapse on them. The tunnel still stands today, more than 170 years on, and that hand-laid brick is the entire reason it does. And the sheer arithmetic of the lining is staggering on its own. More than 6 million of them, laid in curving rings along better than half a mile of tunnel, every ring a self-supporting horseshoe of masonry that carries the downward push of the shale out and around the empty space where the boats would pass. The crews had to dig the clay, mold it, stack it, fire it, haul it into the mountain, and set it in mortar, and then do all of that again and again, for years, while the digging pressed on ahead of them the whole time. This bore is often called the single greatest piece of engineering on the entire canal. Standing in it, what stays with me is the patience of it. A brick wall on that scale, raised by hand in the American backcountry of the 1840s, held, and it holds still. So who were these men? The ones who fired the brick and swung the hammers. The records give us a workforce of as many as 400, and most of them were Irish immigrants, the same labor pool that dug nearly every American canal of that generation. Montgomery could not find or keep enough Irish hands alone, so he brought in English masons, English and Welsh miners, and German laborers to work alongside them. And here I have to be honest about what the historical record keeps and what it throws away. We know Charles Fisk by name because he was the engineer of record. We know Lee Montgomery by name because he signed the contract and lost his fortune under it. The 400 men who actually held the drill steels and breathed the powder smoke and hauled the loaded baskets up those shafts, we mostly do not know by name at all. The construction accounts counted them as labor and moved on. The books tracked the tonnage of rock removed and the price of a keg of powder far more carefully than they recorded the human beings doing the removing. There is a particular injustice buried in that. The canal kept meticulous books. It could tell you to the dollar what a barrel of black powder cost in 1838 and how many cubic yards a crew cleared in a season. It simply did not think the diggers themselves were worth the ink. So when I talk about the 400, understand that I am describing the best documented anonymous army in early American engineering. The tonnage survives. The wages survive. The names, with rare exception, do not. If you want to honor these men, you honor the count, because the count is very nearly all the record left us. And the work did more than exhaust them. It killed some of them. Beyond the ever-present danger of a shale collapse or a mistimed powder charge, disease moved through the crowded work camps, and a cholera epidemic swept the canal laborers during the construction years. The camps were built for that kind of tragedy. Hundreds of men packed into hasty shanties along the river, no clean water to speak of, no sanitation, and medical care that amounted to hoping for the best. When cholera came through, it did not have to work hard. You came to a mountain in the middle of nowhere, you did the most dangerous work in the young country for wages that often arrived late, and you hoped the rock and the fever both left you alone. What the records capture in vivid detail is the trouble between the men. Put 400 workers in an isolated mountain camp, drawn from countries that carried old grievances against each other, house them in rough shanties, pay them poorly, and then stop paying them at all when the money runs thin, and you do not get a harmonious crew. The Paw Paw camp erupted more than once. Across the late 1830s, fighting broke out between the Irish and nearly everyone else, and it flared again and again over several years. A tavern at nearby Old Town was wrecked. Workers' shanties were burned to the ground. The worst of it spilled out near a place called Little Orleans toward the end of the decade, and the men organized themselves into rough early labor bands modeled on the Irish secret societies many of them had known back home, closing ranks over the one grievance they all shared, which was pay that came late, or short, or not at all. And this kind of violence was not new to this canal. A few years earlier and downstream, the Chesapeake in Ohio had produced one of the ugliest labor episodes in the young country's history. In January of 1834, near the town of Williamsport, two rival groups of Irish workers, the Corkonians on one side and the men they called Fardowners on the other, effectively went to war along the canal line. On a single day, roughly 700 men from one faction marched on a camp of about 300 from the other and routed them. Men were killed. The local militia could not contain it. The Maryland legislature asked Washington to step in, and President Andrew Jackson ordered federal soldiers to the canal to restore order. Historians mark that as the first time in American history that federal troops were sent in to put down a labor disturbance. Close to 100 soldiers came, and they stayed for nearly 2 months before the leaders of the rival factions could be brought to sign a formal peace. That was the world the Paw Paw crews lived and worked in. Isolated camps, unpaid men, old country rivalries, cholera in the shanties, and a mountain that would not yield a foot without a fight. Now, the unpaid wages were not really the workers' doing, and they were not truly Montgomery's doing either. They were the mountain's doing, translated into dollars. Every extra month spent fighting the shale, every collapse that had to be dug out a second time, every 1,000 bricks fired to reline a stretch that had failed, all of it cost cash the company simply did not have. A collapse never cost only the price of redigging. It cost the bricks already laid in that stretch, the powder already burned, the weeks of wages already paid out, all of it buried again under fresh shale. The estimate had been $33,500. The real spending blew past that number and kept climbing, past 5 times the estimate, past 10 times, past 15 times, and eventually the money ran out entirely. And when the money stops on a canal, it does not stop quietly in an office. It stops in a shanty camp full of men who have already broken the rock and are owed for it. A good part of the violence at Paw Paw was exactly that. Unpaid men with nowhere to send their anger except at each other and at the raw edge of the frontier around them. The mountain set the terms, and the men at the bottom of the camp were the ones who ended up paying them. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. Around 1841, the work stopped almost completely. The canal company had exhausted its funds, drained for the tunnel and for its whole westward push alike, and the works at Sorrel Ridge sat abandoned in mid-bore for roughly 6 years. Picture what that looked like. A mountain with 2 vertical shafts driven into its crown, and a passage eaten partway through from 6 directions, and then nothing. No hammers ringing on drill steel, no blasting, no baskets riding up the shafts, just an unfinished wound in Sorrel Ridge, a tangle of lawsuits, and a company arguing over debts it could not pay, while the state of Maryland asked out loud whether it had sunk its money into a mountain for nothing at all. A job sold as a 2-year job spent 6 full years doing absolutely nothing because the money to continue did not exist. And 6 years is not a pause. 6 years is long enough for the shafts to fill with water, for the timbering to rot, for the deep cut to slump, for hard-won progress to slide quietly backward into the mountain it came from. Whatever crews returned at the end of the decade did not simply pick up where the work had stopped. They had to fight to recover ground the idle years had taken back. Understand how deep the money trouble ran, because the tunnel was only the sharpest point of it. The entire Chesapeake and Ohio Canal had broken ground back on the 4th of July, 1828, with President John Quincy Adams himself turning the first shovel of earth, and the country had believed it was buying a waterway to the interior at a fair price. By the time the digging was done, the whole canal had cost more than $11 million, against early hopes of $4 or $5 million. The project leaned on the state of Maryland, and on borrowed money over and over, just to keep breathing, and the bore through Sorrel Ridge was the wound that bled the fastest. When a company is already drowning across 180 miles of construction, a single mountain that demands 18 times its promised price can threaten the survival of the whole enterprise. Lee Montgomery did not come through any of it intact. The delays, the labor shortages, the runaway costs, and a maze of lawsuits drove the minister-turned-contractor into bankruptcy. He had accepted a 2-year contract in good faith and handed it more than a decade of his life, and the rock and the ruined finances broke him completely. When the work finally resumed late in the 1840s, it was under different hands. A pair of contractors, the record's name as McCulloch and Day, picked the job back up around 1848 and drove it toward a finish that Montgomery would never get to claim as his own. He had done the hardest years and would not own the ending. I find Montgomery the hardest part of this story to shake. A preacher, a man who presumably believed in providence, who looked at a mountain and saw a 2-year job and a fair profit, and who instead lost the better part of 2 decades and everything he owned to brittle gray shale that did not care what he believed. He is not the villain here. There is no villain here, only a mountain that was harder than the map said, and a budget that was never real to begin with. Montgomery simply happened to be the man standing closest when the difference came due. There was, in the middle of all this grinding failure, one moment that must have felt like pure grace. Back on the 5th of June, 1840, years before a single boat would pass through, the crews digging toward each other from the 2 portals and the 2 shafts finally broke through. The bore was holed clean through the mountain, more than 1,500 feet in from the southern portal, the separate headings meeting in the dark almost exactly where the surveyors had promised they would. After 4 years of hammering blind through shifting shale, From 6 different faces, the two halves of the tunnel became one continuous passage. Imagine being one of the men who swung a hammer at that last wall of rock and watched a point of lamplight open from the far side, proof that another crew had been out there in the black the whole time, digging to meet you, and had found you. That was the proof the impossible thing could be done at all. And yet a hole through a mountain is still not a working tunnel. Ahead of that breakthrough lay years of brickwork still to fire and set, a deep cut to stabilize, and a mountain of debt to outlive before the canal could carry its first boat through the ridge. At last, in 1850, 14 years after the first charge was fired, and 12 years past its original deadline, the Paw Paw Tunnel opened to traffic. Boats could finally pass straight through Sorrel Ridge, gliding in near-total darkness along a towpath barely wide enough for the mules, the brick arch curving overhead, 6 miles of river cut out of the journey at last. After everything, the thing worked exactly as Fisk had drawn it on the map 14 years before. And here the arithmetic turns cruel. In that very same year, 1850, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal reached the coal town of Cumberland and stopped there. Cumberland was never meant to be the end of the line. The canal's own name tells you the ambition baked into it: Chesapeake to Ohio. It was chartered to climb over the Allegheny Mountains and link the tidewater near Washington all the way to the Ohio River, opening a water highway into the heart of the continent, a direct rival to the great Erie Canal to the north. It never got past Cumberland. 184.5 miles up from Georgetown, the canal simply ended, hundreds of miles short of the Ohio River it was named for. The money was spent, and an outsized share of it had vanished into Sorrel Ridge. And waiting for the canal when it finally limped into Cumberland, already there, already hauling western coal east on a schedule, was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which had rolled into that same town 8 years earlier, while the tunnel crews were still down in the dark fighting the shale. The railroad was not just early. It was better suited to the country. A canal freezes in winter and closes. A canal has to be dug and lined and watered every mile of the way, and a mountain like Sorrel Ridge can stop it dead for years. A railroad climbs grades a canal never could, runs through the cold, and lays a mile of track faster than a crew could brick 100 feet of tunnel. By the time the Paw Paw Tunnel let its first boat through, the technology it served was already being overtaken. The canal would haul coal and grain honestly for decades more, but the dream of a water road to the Ohio River died in the mountains of western Maryland, and a great deal of it died in this one tunnel. The canal held on far longer than you might expect for a waterway beaten to its own terminus. Boats worked it into the 20th century, until a great flood in 1924 finally ended commercial traffic for good. In 1938, the federal government bought the whole canal for $2 million, and crews from the Civilian Conservation Corps went to work restoring it. In 1971, the entire 184.5 miles became the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. The ditch that nearly bankrupted itself boring one tunnel is now a national treasure, walked and paddled and biked by millions of people every year, and the Paw Paw Tunnel is the crown of it. So was the tunnel worth it? That question has hung over this place for well over a century and a half, and I honestly do not think it has a clean answer. Judge it strictly as a business decision, and it looks like a catastrophe. It devoured money the canal could not spare. It helped strand the entire waterway at Cumberland, hundreds of miles from its namesake river. It was very nearly obsolete against the railroad on the day it opened. By every column in the ledger, the mountain won the argument, and the doubt the skeptics carried back in 1836 turned out to be entirely justified in years and in dollars. But go and stand inside it, and the argument quietly flips. The Paw Paw Tunnel is still here. You can walk its full 3,118 feet along the old towpath today, in the dark, with the Brallier Shale still pressing down from overhead, and more than 6 million handmade bricks still holding it back, set exactly where the masons placed them by lamplight before the Civil War. Not one of those bricks was laid by a machine. Every foot of that passage was hammered out of live rock by men turning drill steels and swinging hammers, blasting with black powder, and hauling the debris up shafts with their hands and their horses. Walk it now and you will need a light, because the middle of the tunnel goes genuinely dark, dark enough that you lose the far opening entirely, and there is nothing overhead but a curved ceiling of brick and the whole weight of the mountain resting on top of it. In that dark, it is easy to forget the money and the lawsuits and the ruined contractor, and to feel only the work, the hammer marks, the rings of brick, and the strange fact that it takes about 2 seconds to walk across a full week of some anonymous man's labor. The tunnel stands about 24 feet high and 27 feet wide inside, with the old canal channel filling most of it, and a narrow towpath along one side, a wooden railing the only thing between a walker and the water in the dark. It was wide enough for only one boat to pass at a time, so even finished and working, the passage stayed a tight, slow, single-file bottleneck for as long as the canal ran, and it has outlasted all of it. It has outlasted the canal, which carried its last load of coal in 1924. It has outlasted the company that nearly died paying for it. It has outlasted the working life of the entire waterway it was built to serve. Here is what I keep circling back to. In the 1840s, with no power tools, no dynamite, no electric light, and no machines of any kind, a few hundred immigrant laborers and one stubborn preacher-turned-contractor drove a brick-lined tunnel more than half a mile through a collapsing shale mountain and brought the two ends together in the dark within inches of the line. We could build that tunnel faster today, with machines the men of the 1840s could not have imagined. What I doubt is whether we would build it to last the way they did, by hand, in brittle shale, and have it still holding up a whole mountain nearly 2 centuries later. The proof is standing in western Maryland right now, and the machines that were supposed to replace it went to rust generations ago. I keep coming back to 2 images. Lee Montgomery walking away from this mountain with nothing but bankruptcy after giving it the heart of his life. And the 400 men, most of them nameless in the record, whose patient hammer and brick work is still holding the weight of an entire ridge off the heads of everyone who walks the towpath today. Those 2 facts belong together, because the failure and the achievement were never separate events. They were the same 14 years, the same mountain, the same 400 pairs of hands. The ledger says this tunnel should never have been built. The mountain, lined in 6 million bricks and still standing, says otherwise every single day. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name, in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.